Right on time. I'm sorry. Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding in the middle of the holy Chassidic Rebbes Naaseh. The mimer is called Naaseh. Let us build an attic. Let us build a small place within our heart, within ourselves, for the spirit of purity to dwell. Every Jew has a connection to godliness, an innate, unchanging, incorruptible connection to God. The problem is that in our lives we're sometimes out of touch with this spirit of godliness. So what do we have to do to not be out of touch with it, and on the contrary, to have it totally transform who we are? We have to build for it a little attic, a little room inside in which it lives. And the Talmud teaches us that this room has to be furnished with four things. If you want there to be a room where the man of God, the spirit of purity, dwells, that room has to be furnished with four things. There's a bed, there's a table, there's a chair, and there's a lamp. And as the Rebbe goes on to explain, these four things are actually all part of the daily cycle of the Jews' worship of Hashem. In other words, every day we take this room and we put in it all four of these things. What are the four things? The bed is the Kriyas Shema, the reading of the Shema before we go to sleep. The table is the beginning of the Shacharis prayer until Shema, of the morning prayer until we say the Shema. After the chair you have that's the table. After that you have the chair, which is the reciting of the morning Shema in davening, when we say the Shema, the three paragraphs of the Shema. And then you have the lamp, the menorah, which is the Shemona Esrei, the silent standing prayer of the morning davening. So you have one at night, which is the bed. The other three are part of the morning prayer. And these are the three furnishings that you put in this room, that you bring this spirit of purity, this holy man of God, into your life to dwell constantly. If you want to feel a connection with God, not create a connection with God, as we've said repeatedly, that's the first mistake. That's the first rookie error. The first rookie error is that you have to create a connection with God. It's not true. You already have a connection with God. What's the problem? The problem is that you, within yourself, are disconnected from that reality. You have a part of you, maybe even most of you, which is not aware of this connection with God. How do you clear that path? How do you unclog and make that pure, continuous connection? It's by furnishing this room with these four things. So we went through them, we began. And really what it's a process of doing, as we said right at the beginning, what does it mean to reconnect the part of you that's unaware of the spirit of holiness with godliness? What does it mean to make that connection, to unclog that pipe in practical terms? In other words, that's very abstract, that's a nice idea. What does that actually mean? It means you have to transform the animal soul. Every one of us has a biological life. Every one of us is alive in a similar way to the way that an animal is alive. We have a self-centered existence that is grounded. We are the ultimate ground of our own existence, which is a very shaky foundation for anyone to exist upon, as themselves. We have to take that part of us that is grounded only in ourselves, and we have to educate it and transform it so that it loves and fears God the way that it loves and fears itself, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. The good news is that it's a daily cycle. It's not a one and done thing. You don't expect immediate, it's not a magical thing. It's something that is done in these four steps every day. And every day you grow and proceed a little bit further. So we began to explain, how do you take this biological life, this animal life, this part of me which says, I exist as my own end, I exist as an end unto myself. How do you take that and make it care about God? So the first step is in Kriyas Shema that you say before you go to sleep. The Kriyas Shema that you say before you go to sleep is really a time for reckoning. You think about the previous day and you think about how it could have been versus how it was. It should have been a day that was totally devoted to God. And instead, it was a day that was devoted to myself at various levels, each person at their own level, and as we explained in detail from the Rebbe at length. What does that do? That allows the person to create, and vitally, I'll keep repeating it because it's vitally important, the whole process starts at night. You can't wake up in the morning and think you're going to start. That's the next rookie mistake. The next rookie mistake is, it's a brand new morning, it's a brand new day, how do I start? The answer is, you already messed up from the previous night. So you don't start in the morning. That's the first mistake. That's the second mistake now. You start the previous night. You decide, morgen wird sein gar anders, as the Chassidim used to say, tomorrow is going to be completely different. That's the first step. The first step is the decision, tomorrow is going to be different than today was. What does this do? This decision brings the animal soul to a point where when you start to talk to it about God in the morning, it's able in the very slightest way, a vitally important but still slight way, to hear that idea. It's ready to hear. How do I talk to someone who's not interested at all? And the answer is you can't, which is why you have to start the night before, right? The night before you come to your senses, right? You've come to your senses from the previous night. In other words, you had a whole day that was self-centered, and now I remember there's something beyond myself. So you take what you have recalled, you take this coming to your senses, and you say, I'm going to live tomorrow with that, right? Even though it's a very tall order, because you understand you're a totally self-centered being and you don't even know where to start. But just the decision that tomorrow is going to be different, I'm going to live with God, makes an impact for when you wake up in the morning. Then the next step, the Rebbe explains, you wake up in the morning and you say Meda'ani. Meda'ani is called the first Haidah. It's the first acknowledgement, or the first admission, we said, like admitting something. Why do we say it's an admission? What are you admitting? You're admitting that I did not cause myself to be alive today. I could have died in my sleep. I have no control over that, right? It is because God wants me to be alive this morning that I'm alive this morning. That is the first admission. Why admission? Because, as the Rebbe explains, it's like you're seeing something with your own eyes that you know is true, even though you can't understand it yet, right? In other words, when you first wake up in the morning, when the animal soul is in its default position, so to speak, just having woken up, it doesn't know what God is yet. That it should feel love and fear towards God, for example, right? That it should have an emotional connection with the Creator. In order to have an emotional connection with something, you have to know it. You have to understand something about it. First thing in the morning, we don't understand God yet. This is literally the first thing right when you open your eyes. We don't understand yet. However, we are willing to admit, even though we don't understand, the obvious fact that I have been given life for a new day, not by myself, but by my Creator. That I'm essentially been blessed with life again. This is the first acknowledgement, the first admission. Then you proceed and you say all the morning blessings, what it says in the Siddur, right? And up to Shacharis, which is a whole section, which is very interesting. And it's all, as we explained, about getting the animal soul into that position where it's ready to make the second acknowledgement. The second acknowledgement is Hodu la'avaya kiru b'shmoi, which is the first line of the prayer that we say together with the minyan, right, in Shacharis. Together, you've got your talis on, your tefillin on, you say Hodu la'Hashem kiru b'shmoi. It's the same word, Meda'ani and Hodu, right? That's why it's called the second acknowledgement. What's the difference with the second acknowledgement? Is that you have reminded the animal soul with the beginning part of the prayer, but by the time you get to minyan, you have reminded yourself sufficiently what God is, enough that you can begin to praise Him. In other words, you have arrived at a position where it's not just there is a God, but I have no idea what He is. It's there is a God, and now let me come to grips with this concept, so to speak. And really, that's what the beginning of the Siddur is. As you continue, and as you get into the Psukei de Zimra, which is after Baruch She'amar, right? You start saying these chapters of the Psalms, which praise God. And what is it all about, essentially, as we've spoken about the last two classes? You are explaining to the animal soul why the things that it already loves and understands are really, at essence, godly, right? You like the snow, you like the mountains, you like eating food, you like all these different things that you as an animal soul can appreciate, all these finite things, right? All of those things are an expression of godliness. Where do you think those things come from? What you love about that food is really a very lowly and a very coarse expression of godliness. Everything that you love and fear, everything that you have an emotional relationship to, right, is based in godliness. That's where all of these things come from. That's the source and the root for all the things that you already love and fear. We don't come to the animal soul and tell it there's this huge God who's infinitely beyond you and you should just feel like nothing before him, because that's not very convincing. The animal soul would say, never heard of him, right? Like Pareh said recently, as we've been reading in Chumash, Pareh says, never heard of him, never heard of his name, what's the big deal, right? I know that I come from somewhere, but I don't see what this whole abstract thing is. So the Jewish sages in their infinite wisdom in arranging the prayer book and arranging the order of the prayer said we don't start talking about this infinite God and angels and all these abstract things. We start talking about things that the animal soul understands by itself, right? All the worldly things praising God, the way that they are created by God and reflect God in them. And there are many, many discourses of Chassidus about these concepts. After we discuss that, we are still really in the middle in our mimer of the discussion of the Psukei de Zimra, of the verses of praise. We haven't yet explained why they're called the shulchan, why they're called the table, right, which is the second piece of furniture after the bed of the four that we furnish this inner room for, where we're furnishing the room for that spirit of purity. We haven't explained why it's a table yet, but we've made a very important discussion, a very important digression. Because what we were discussing most of last week is the nature of the animal soul. The animal soul is primarily an emotional being. And when we read emotional, we should read self-centered, right? Subjective. It is grounded always in itself. In fact, even when it thinks, why does it think? It thinks only for its self-benefit, right? It is essentially emotional, not intellectual. Then, which is why we need to speak to it with the godly soul, right? As we explained at length last week. If you just come to the animal soul and rely on its conception of God, it's a disaster, because no matter how highly and how selflessly the animal soul thinks, there's always another layer, and that other layer is self-centered and totally focused, grounded within itself. The animal soul alone has only finite conceptions of godliness. No matter what lofty thoughts it thinks, all those thoughts are based in the self. I'm reminded of, I heard a very good, very sharp Vart, a very sharp teaching from Reb Mendel Futterfass, the great Chassid, because you know that Chassidus talks a lot about how, we spoke about it in Shar Yichud V'Emunah, in Tanya, the last thing we were learning. We talked about how everything in the world is just a metaphor for a certain divine reality, right? Like the sweetness of the apple is derived from God's kindness, ultimately, right? So Rav Mendel Futterfass used to verbring. Rav Mendel Futterfass was very accustomed to speaking not to the godly soul and the highest conceptions from Tanya, but to the animal soul. So Rav Mendel Futterfass said that there are certain Jews who walk around and they realize that everything in life is a metaphor. And he used to go through from the lowest, from the fleas and the ticks and the mosquitoes, all the way up through the animal kingdom and also the inanimate and the vegetative and human beings and the heavens above and the worlds of Yetzirah and the angels in the world of Bria and the souls in the world of Atzilus. These Jews walk around and they know that the whole world is a metaphor, is a mashal, is an analogy. And what's the analog? What do all the metaphors explain? All the metaphors explain gelt. They all explain money. Right? He was he was making a commentary, right? Chassidus comes and tells us everything is a metaphor for godliness. There are some Jews who walk around, they think that everything, all the worlds above and below, why am I learning about angels? Why am I saying in the davening that ranks of angels say, holy, holy, holy? What is all that about? It's all a metaphor for how I earn money. Right? In other words, there are such people. There are such people who pretend to very abstract visions, and they're great philosophers, and they have a whole life philosophy and a podcast and a book and a this and a that. But what does all of their great abstraction conclude in? It concludes in my own self-success, right? It's all about me being successful. That's what the whole structure and all the grand thoughts that I have and all the great achievements of my mind is all just about my own success, right? So that's the point. That's an animal soul, right? And it's not always money. It expresses in different ways. Different people want different things. There's different types of animal souls it talks about in Chassidus, just like there's many different types of animals. There's many different types of animal souls. The Alter Rebbe talks about how some people have an animal soul that's like an ox. It's very strong and fiery and passionate, and some people have an animal soul which is like a lamb. It's very passive. All different types. But the common denominator is that they're emotional, which means that everything that they do, even their intellect, is rooted in themselves. That's what we discussed last week, which is why you need a godly soul. You need a place of pure selflessness within you from which to draw these lessons and the sense of godliness to the animal soul. It's important that the godliness should not come, we should know that our conception of godliness that is true, that we are learning, that we are reminding ourselves of when we read from the Siddur every morning, when we read from the prayer book, that sense of godliness does not come from within the animal soul. It's not corrupted, right? The Torah and the holiness and the Yiddishkeit and the deep place, the deep pure place of connection to God within us is not corrupted by this selfishness. We have within us a place that is purely selfless, which is why you need a godly soul. It's not enough just to have an animal soul, right? Then we ask the opposite question. Okay, well, if the animal soul corrupts everything that it touches, so to speak, then why not just have a godly soul? Why do you need an animal soul at all? And that's what we began to explain last week. Because the animal soul has something that even the godly soul does not. Right? Apart from the fact, as I said last week, that of course we are on a mission to transform the animal soul, and that's really what God puts us in the world for. But it's even better than that, right? It's like, I'll do you one better. It's not just that you have to deal with the animal soul and just, so to speak, suck it up, even though it's terrible, right? That you should have an animal soul. The Chassidic Rebbes is saying, in fact, it's actually not so terrible. The animal soul is actually, on its own terms, vital and important and beneficial to the worship of God. It's not just that it's the goal or the object or the enemy on this battlefield, if you want to follow the statement of the Zohar that prayer is a time of war. Right? It's not just that it's the enemy itself will help you. Conquering that enemy will actually give you more than you could have ever had on your own if you just ignored the enemy and were left to your own devices. And we began to explain it in the following terms. We said that
it's a potential agent of change for the positive.
Correct, and not just for the positive, for the godly. How so? Because the animal soul, by being essentially emotional creation, by having this, what we've been calling this self-centered existence, it's actually has the potential to be very warm. And we began to discuss the difference between coldness and warmth in a spiritual way. What's the difference between coldness and warmth? Some people think, the previous Rebbe said, that the mind is cold and the heart is warm. In other words, the mind thinks objectively with detachment, and the heart, the emotions are subjective, right? Everything's personal. You're personally involved, and that's what it means warm. But the Rebbe says that's really not the case. The coldness of the mind is not true coldness. The coldness of the mind is just, so to speak, deliberateness, care, right? Objectivity, but not in a cold way. The mind is simply not attached to things the way that the emotions are, but that doesn't mean it's cold. It just means that it's deliberate, careful, right? Careful to see the thing and to receive the thing exactly as it is, right? So when we say someone is a cold person, the Rebbe says, we do not mean, usually, that they are an intellectual. What we normally mean, and by we I mean when the Rebbe says someone is cold, the Rebbe means that the person has developed a numbness, an insensitivity due to self-centeredness. And this is where it becomes a very sort of subtle picture the previous Rebbe is painting. Because on the one, what was the downfall of the animal soul? What's its problem? Its problem is that it's self-centered, right? Everything it touches, everything it's involved in is based totally on self. What is the redeeming quality of the animal soul? Turns out it's the exact same quality, right? Being self-centered, being emotional, actually can express in a positive fashion, which is called warmth.
Called what?
What?
Called what?
Warmth. Chamimut, heat, warmth. So really, the selfishness and the self-centeredness of the animal soul is more a problem if it makes the person numb. If it does the opposite, if the self-centeredness expresses not as numbness, but as a warmth and an openness and a connection to other things, then in fact, it can be a huge advantage. It can be a huge advantage in the service of Hashem. Let's read how the previous Rebbe describes this. I am on page Kuf Samach Vav, which if you don't read Hebrew is the second side of the second sheet. I'm about halfway through the second paragraph on the page. The line starts, Hayeshus. The word is Veyesh. Four words into the line on Kuf Samach Vav. Continues the Friedrich Rebbe. So he has been saying there's someone who's cold and their coldness is derived from their sense of self-importance. As Spencer put it last week, it's their defense mechanism, right? Why are they cold? They're cold because they're totally wrapped up in themselves, right? They're not open to experience. The opposite of Chassidic joy, as I told you last week. That's some people. That's what happens when the animal soul gets really bad. A really bad situation, a total life of total self-centeredness, you become cold, numb, unable to feel, unable to connect. It's a state of total self-absorption. But there are some people who their nature is that they are warm and passionate and easily excited. Hanikra b'lashon b'nei Adam a hitziger mensch, which is called, and in the language of human beings, which is Yiddish, a hitziger mensch, a hot, a warm person, right? Und tut op a zach behisragshus, and what he does with excitement, with feeling. Nit eisgerechend, he doesn't do it in a way where it's all calculated beforehand. He's not approaching things with in a calculated way. Now remember, this calculation, he's not putting down people who are intellectual. That's not the issue, because the coldness is not an intellectual coldness, right? There's two ways you can approach things in a calculating. When you say a calculating person, right? There can be a person who's very warm, but they're calculating because they're intellectual, right? In other words, they approach everything in a head way. They approach everything as an idea, right? But that doesn't mean they're cold, and that's not what he's talking about. The opposite of a warm person is a calculating person, in the sense that why are they calculating? For self-preservation, right? Everything is calculated out because it's all about control of the situation. It's all about making sure I end up in the correct place in the situation, right? It's this numbness that comes from self-involvement. It's not, let me understand everything because I'm intellectual. That's something else. This is calculating like
It's the term in the movies, the cold-hearted bastard.
he's calculating.
It's used all the time in movies.
He's cunning, right? Cunning is different than smart or wise or intellectual, right? He's cunning. He approaches the situation not abstractly with the abstract intellect and objective reckoning, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That just means the person's intellectual. He approaches it with a self-centered calculation, a calculation that he ends up in the best position, right? But the warm person is not like this. They approach everything warmly and with excitement and without calculation, right? They are open to experience. And in general, the majority of them do things that are actually beyond their capacity, that are beyond their ability. In other words, because these people are warm and open to things, they actually have, it's kind of like a superpower, we would say, in all those books that all the animal souls wrote for self-betterment. They would call it a superpower, right? Where they have an ability, because they're so warm and they're so open to experience and to things, and they're so not calculated, they can actually bypass a lot of the things that really should hold them back. They have an ability to kind of do things beyond their normal limits because they are warm. And why is it a good thing to be warm? You could think, right? You could think that if I'm warm and I'm open, that means I'm equally warm and open to both positive and negative things, right? I'm warm and open, but I could be open to terrible things, right? That are very negative, that are morally reprehensible. Says the Chassidic Rebbes, that's not what actually happens. A person who is warm and open in this way is more moved by good things than by bad things. Right? A person who is truly warm and truly open is actually more, it has a positive valence, you would say, in physics. It's decidedly a positive thing. It's not balanced. It turns out always towards the good, right?
But that comes from the animal soul?
Yep, absolutely. The haraya, and what is the proof? The kasher esadavar loitev u'mischaret alzeh. When he does something which is bad, he regrets it. The kasher esadavar tov k'mei betzdaka g'meles chasadim b'betircha gedela b'shvil tevis chaverei. When he does something which is good, like giving charity, or doing kindness, or exerting great effort for the good of his fellow man, for the good of his friend, Hagam shehichbid alav beyoser, even though it's very difficult for him. In other words, he takes a great weight on his shoulders to do this good to another person. Nevertheless, he never regrets this at all. The warm person, the Chassidic Rebbes says, how do we know that the warmness is tilted more towards good than towards bad? Look at what they regret, right? This warm person, this loving person who's easily excited, maybe loving's the wrong word, this easily excited person, this easily moved person, emotionally open, right? The emotionally open person who's not so stuck in himself that he's numb, but rather he's sensitive to things, right? This sensitivity is more of a positive than a negative, because even though he is more sensitive to negative things, he is actually, the positive balance is much more. It works out much more to the positive. What's the proof? The proof is you look at what he regrets. You look at what he regrets. If he does something bad, he regrets it. If he does something good, even if the good thing was very difficult, was very painful, right? In other words, he had to he sacrificed a lot for the good thing, he doesn't regret it. Right? He doesn't regret it. He doesn't regret doing the good thing.
Why would he?
What do you mean?
He did something good, why would you regret?
Maybe it cost him a lot of money.
No, because that's the whole question. I agree, that's the question, but that's like the question is its own answer. In other words, the whole point
Brad
is
saying there's an opportunity cost.
There could be.
well, obviously
Could
there's
regret it.
no, there is an opportunity cost for sure. That's what we're saying. He sacrificed something to do this, sometimes a great amount. But the real thing is if this emotive quality of this emotional openness, right, were had no positive moral component, why should whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do make a difference to it? That's really the question. Your question is self-answering. In other words, why would you regret the good thing to do? The answer is exactly, that's what we're saying. We're saying that this person, this emotive quality, this animal quality of openness and warmth is actually inherently inclined towards doing the good. It's actually a positive thing. It has a certain moral sense, it has a certain moral quality, and that moral quality is actually determined towards the good. Once you understand this, by the way, just one second. Once you understand this, by the way, you understand a lot of what all the Chassidic masters said, that, you know, sadness is not a sin, but it's worse than all of the other sins, right? For example, right? Or what Rabbi Silverman said from Zalman Moshe at the Fabrengen a few weeks ago, for those who were there, for those who remember, that it's better to be happy about worldly things, about physical things, than to be sad about holy things, right? I didn't do this mitzvah, or I did this sin, right? Why is happiness so fundamental to the Kabbalists and to the Chassidim who were their students, right? Why is happiness so vital and so essential? In truth, it's a very deep topic, really deserves its own class, and maybe we'll do a class on Simcha and Chassidic joy, more than one maybe. But here we're touching on the topic. Here we're touching on the idea. Why is happiness so important? Because the very state of being open to the soul of each thing, which is really what Chassidic happiness is, a state of inner openness to each and everything as it is, has an essentially positive valence. Being happy is a good thing. People think being happy is like I could be happy over a good thing or a bad thing equally. Being happy is a good unto itself. Really, happy is a terrible translation. Being joyous, being emotionally open is what we're describing here. This warmth, this openness, right, is a fundamentally positive thing.
But by definition, it can only be for a selfish purpose.
Sure, on its own, right? So not only, so let's continue and get to more of the. Let's see more of the picture from the Rebbe here. Not only does the warm and open person not regret the good things he does, but he even takes pleasure from the pain that he exerted to help another person, right? That he enjoys the exertion and the sacrifice that he does for others because of the moral good of it, right? That if it weren't for warmth, the thing would not have been accomplished, I believe is the correct translation. Now we get to Barry's point. Specifically, those who have set times for Torah learning and are found in an environment of those who study the Torah, in the end, is a famous phrase, which is, in my opinion, an incredibly powerful statement from our sages. The source of light in the Torah will return them to good. In other words, to speak to Barry's point, isn't if this openness and this warmth is an animal quality, isn't it ultimately self-centered, like we said before? And the answer is, it's like the Rebbe told. Well, let me not confuse matters. Isn't it a bad thing that all of this warmth is really self-centered? The person has a self-centered openness, just like they can have a self-centered closeness. And the answer is that by itself, it's self-centered, but it's so good, it has such inherent potential that if he is especially if the person is in an environment of those who study the Torah, and he himself studies Torah, the Torah is able to take a person and hamar sheba machziram lemutav, which means not that he'll take the Torah and say, okay, how can I be a better person? And he'll fix himself. The luminary present in the Torah will automatically take him to great heights, will just by the act of studying Torah, not about self-improvement, right? In other words, it's not an intellectual thing. It's a connection to godliness thing. In other words, what is the previous Rebbe saying? He's saying if you have a person that's open to anything, and openness is inherently in the neshama, and openness is inherently more open to good than it is to bad. If you give a person who's open like that, who has that emotional warmth, just a little bit of Torah, you'll see what happens to them is they'll shoot like a rocket ship, right? Because they're open, right? They're open to the souls of things, they'll be open to the soul of Torah. And when they learn Torah, not the words of the Torah, not the apparent meaning of the words of Torah, but the godliness of Torah, the godly stuff of which Torah is made, will speak directly to them, will speak directly to that animal, and will lift it up out of its selfishness. Right? That's the idea. So that's why the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying, especially a person who is open, especially a person who's found in a Torah environment, right? Such an open person, their chances of ending up good rather than bad are immense, right? It's an incredibly positive thing to be warm in this way, right? Now I'll tell you what the Rebbe said. Someone came to the Rebbe, I'm going to butcher the story because I don't remember it properly, but someone came to the Rebbe and essentially said that they were a very, very smart person, very intellectual, learned. They'd studied a lot of things. And I believe in their youth they were religious, and then they had left that path, and they had studied, they had a PhD, 12 PhDs in whatever. Very, very, very well-educated, smart person. And the Rebbe, and they told the Rebbe that they're so far from the they wanted to come back, but they're so far from Judaism and Yiddishkeit and godliness. They'd wandered so far off the way. What the Rebbe told them essentially is that you have, if you're wandering on the road, right, and you're going to go off the way, what would you rather have? You'd rather have the strongest stallion or an old sick horse with one bad leg, right? So the person told the Rebbe, I would rather have the old sick horse with one bad leg, because if I wander off the path, I won't get very far, right? I can come back more easily. In other words, what the person was saying is, I have a lot of intellectual abilities. I can go very far, very fast, and I got so far away with all of my abilities. And the Rebbe said, I would rather have the fast horse, because the fast horse, even though he can go much further off, he's much quicker to come back. Better to have the stronger horse, right? That's what the previous Rebbe is describing here. The previous Rebbe is describing the faster horse, the emotional disposition of the animal soul to warmth, right, is the faster horse. If you have that emotional openness, right, if you have this warmth and ability to get easily excited, all you have to do is point that horse back at the road, which is not very difficult, relatively not very difficult, and the horse will get back on the path, will get back in the road very, very fast, and take you to your destination very, very quickly. Right? That's essentially what the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying. Okay? So you have a warm person and a cold person. Right? Now, within the person, within us, ourselves, you also have a warm person and a cold person, so to speak. In other words, that's two types of people, two emotional qualities. And the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to say, and within us, within each and every person, there's also both qualities, right? V'chein hu ba'nefesh habahamis. Oh, sorry.
There's another level of warmth and coldness within a person? Because you just said there's warmth and there's cold.
I was talking, until now, the Chassidic Rebbe, the truth is that I've been expanding with my explanation into sort of other things. Now until now, what the Rebbe has been discussing in the text of the Maimer is just dispositional, emotional, either warmth or coldness, right? And it's much better to be a warm person, is what he said so far. Now what he's going to say is that you can understand a warm person versus a cold person within a single human being. There's a warm person and a cold person. 1 second. All shall reveal itself. Someone who's open will be more excited by having positive traits. And as I said, in conclusion, their excitement allows them to come to good things more easily. They're easily excited, their warmth, their openness. So too it is with the animal soul within each and every person, right? Even in a cold person. You have a person who's cold and numb, but there's one part of them which is warmer and less cold and less numb than the other part. What do we mean? How does that work? So let's read and explain. The animal soul is much more easily excited. The animal soul has an ability to be open and excited in a way that no other part of the person does. And therefore, when we are reading in the Siddur, right, coming back to our main topic now after a long diversion, when we are reading in the Siddur the verses of praise, all those chapters of Psalms in general, and specifically contemplating the blessings before the Shema, where we talk about angels. Mostly what it talks about is angels, clearly a higher and more abstract level of reality. When we contemplate these things, the angels and the holy chayos, literally the holy animals, the animal soul is awakened, is aroused and excited, and it affects an inner carving. Right? I forgot to mention in the review, we spoke about the outer carving and the inner carving. So when you're trying to make like a cup from a big piece of wood, right? There's two carvings you have to do. First, you have to carve it from the outside to get the piece that you're going to turn into the cup, and then you carve from the inside to make the actual inside of the cup, which can which can hold liquid or whatever it is, right? The reason why the animal soul is beneficial to the person is because the animal soul has this warmth and has this excitement that we have been discussing more than any other part of the person. In other words, why do we not just have the godly soul? Why do we have to involve the animal soul at all? Or to phrase it differently, what benefit comes from involving the animal soul? And the answer is the animal soul is the fast horse. Right? The animal soul is the fast horse. If you can get the animal soul excited about godliness, it has a passion and a power. And we're going to discuss more sort of the inner, like the deeper nature of this passion and power in a moment. But it has this passion and power that even the godly soul does not have. And it's like harnessing an animal, right? The comparison in Chassidus, I think he actually says it inside in just a minute. He's actually going to say this. But the comparison in Chassidus is like what you can harvest from a field on your own versus if you can saddle up an ox, right? The old farming metaphor, right? Today we would say a tractor. You have an animal. The animal is very, very powerful. The problem is it needs direction, right? But if you can harness the power of that animal, right, it's much more powerful than what the human being can accomplish. Within the human heart, the animal nature is like the ox. The godly soul is like a human being. In fact, it's called a child, a very small, weak human being, right? The power of the animal soul is immense. The power of that inner biological, that selfish life is much more powerful than the inner selflessness of the godly soul. If you can harness that selfishness, if you can take that self-centeredness and direct it towards God, you will go much further and much faster than you would otherwise. Just like when you take that person who's naturally emotionally warm and you expose him to Torah, expose him to godliness, he will go much further and much faster than the person who by nature is cold. That's the metaphor. Everyone hear the metaphor? Everyone understand? Any questions until this point? Okay. Because behold, why does the animal soul get particularly excited when we read about angels? A little small point here. He says, the Rebbe said, it gets especially excited when we read about the animals, about the angels, before we say Shema. Why is that particularly exciting? Because the animal soul's root, its own spiritual root, comes from the dregs of the Eifanim. In other words, the lowest angels excrete, in the negative sense of the term, in a way, right? Their waste, their byproduct, let's say, is the source of the animal soul. In other words, the animal soul really has its root, really has its source in the angels themselves, which is why some of the angels are actually called Chayos HaKodesh, right? The holy animals. Angels are actually a lot like animals, right? They're like animals, except they're animals with a superhuman intelligence. You have to figure out how that works, because nowadays they've decided the only difference between a human and an animal is human intelligence, right? And even that, every day there's questions. Maybe the animals are all smarter than us, and people are very excited about this sort of thing. But the truth is that Torah doesn't believe that the difference between a human being and an animal is mere intelligence, first of all. Second of all, Chassidus in particular looks at an angel a lot like an animal with superhuman intelligence. An angel is something with an intelligence really probably incomprehensible to a human being, the way an angel has intelligence, what the angel understands. And yet, they're still not like a human being. They're still like an animal. In what sense? They don't have that human free choice. They're still instinctual beings, right? Just like the lion has its nature and it's different than the nature of a lamb, so too one angel has its nature which is different than another angel. It's not like a human being where a human being has all natures and all ways open within them. The human has perfectly balanced free choice and can even change his nature to be like any of the different things, right? An angel is not like that. An angel has a certain set nature that a human being doesn't have. Please don't ask me too many questions about it. I don't really understand it myself, but I at least know the right words to say. At least that's something. Okay, so the animal soul, but this at least I do understand a little bit. The animal soul is most excited when it hears about the angels. Why? Because essentially what you are doing is you are exposing the animal soul to its own source. In other words, if the animal soul, if you daven properly, which is very difficult, if you daven properly, the animal soul is introduced before you say Shema. This is where you come from, right? In other words, you, self-centered biological being, you too are godly, right? It's not like Psukei de Zimra. Psukei de Zimra is where you say, look at all those things in the world, the verses of praise, right? Like between Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach, is where you say, look at all the things in the world that are godly. Look, you have the river is godly, the mountain is godly, the mountain worships God in its way, the sun worships God in its way, right? The trees worship God in their way. All the different people of the earth worship God in their way, right? And all the source of life and the sustenance of everything. God is sustaining and giving life to everything in the world, right? Then you come to Birchas Kriyas Shema, where you start talking about angels. And essentially, if you do it right, and if you really understand what you're saying, which is no simple matter, you essentially tell the animal soul, and guess what? You too are an expression of godliness.
Is that why they say animal soul comes from a higher level than the godly soul?
That is a different, no, that's not. Nope, that's a different discussion. That's a good point. Say again?
What was the expression?
That the animal soul comes from a higher place than the godly soul, which has a certain point to it, but that is definitely not, for now, at least not yet. We'll discuss that at a different time, maybe. The animal soul has its root. The animal soul has its root in the angels. Really, of course, it is connected. It's inescapable, but I'm not going to talk about it. The animal soul has its root in the angels. You are telling the animal, you, biological being, right? You who think that you are the center of your own universe. You yesh is what we would say in the language of Chassidus. The yesh, you thing which think you are so independent, right? A yesh means an independent reality, something that perceives itself in its own terms, as the measuring stick by which all things are measured, is a yesh, right? Literally, the word translated just means something, but it's not, it doesn't have the full, I have to give you more words to flesh out the... So you tell the animal soul, you yesh, you, thing which thinks you exist independently, who think that you exist on your own terms, guess what? You are just the minutest of the minutest, the glimmer of a glimmer, the most pale, minor, negligible version of something that is you, but much more godly, right? In other words, the angel that you come from, the spiritual self-centered beings, right? The spiritual yeshes which precede you, the spiritual self-centerednesses that precede you, right? Because the animal self-centeredness has to come from somewhere. Everything has a source in godliness, right? So there's a godly source of self-centeredness, which comes through the angels, right? For whatever reason, Chassidus, you can read hundreds of pages about this in Chassidus, but it comes through the angels. And you should know that your self-centeredness, your very self, who thinks that you are so big that everything in the universe should be judged by you, you're a glimmer of a glimmer. You're the dregs of the dregs, the byproduct of the byproduct of a true self-centeredness, of something that was self-centered but is infinitely beyond you, right? And when you expose something to its source in this very true way, it ceases to be. Self-abnegation, bittul, as we call it in Chassidus, right? You expose it to where it comes from and it ceases to exist. The way it's described in Kabbalah, I forget which sefer, is that God sticks out his little finger and consumes the angels, right? The angels burn up and disappear. What does that mean? It means that his little finger is like his smallest expression, right? His small, the littlest bit. The only thing that allows the angel, in this case is the yesh in our example, right? The only thing that allows it to exist, even for a second, as an independent reality, as something that thinks it exists on its own terms, is its total ignorance of its own source, right? If we remove that screen for a second and let it see where it comes from, utter and total dissolution, ceases to be independent, ceases to be its own independent reality. So when you tell the animal, you start speaking to the animal about the angel, that's the part that really speaks to the animal, right? In other words, if I just had a godly soul, speaking to it about angels would not accomplish as much as speaking to the animal soul about angels. Because the animal soul, like we said before, has that power. It's the fast horse, it's the good horse, right? And when you tell the good horse, you show it that you have nothing of your own. Your entire existence is to go on the road, not to go wandering in the woods. Your whole existence and your very being is to go wandering on the road. If you're off the road, there is literally no basis for your being. And you are not an independent being. You are not a horse that goes on its own way. Your entire existence is to serve a human rider, and that's what you're for, right? That awareness that the horse does not really exist as a horse. The horse only exists as transportation for a rider, right? Makes the animal soul totally, its sense of independence totally disappears. And that fast horse will get you back to the road much faster than if you had no horse, right? That's essentially what the previous Rebbe is saying here. By the way, this idea that you are only a vehicle for godliness and have none of your own ideas is actually what Kabbalah and Chassidus say about who? About the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They are called Merkava. They are called a chariot. But what's a chariot? We don't have chariots nowadays. A chariot's a ride, right? It's a car. It's the fast horse, right? Abraham didn't move his finger in this world of his own accord, right? Isaac did nothing. Nothing in thought, nothing in speech, nothing in action, nothing in emotion, and nothing in mind that was not for the purpose of transporting the rider, right? No independent being whatsoever. That's what it means, a chariot, right? That's what it means, a chariot. They're chariots of God. I'm just showing you how this metaphor carries. This metaphor is very applicable widely in Chassidus. So the animal soul source is in these angels, in this higher self-centeredness. There's a godly source of self-centeredness. Luzais, therefore, b'havana v'yedias bittul mekere, in its understanding and its emotional comprehension, its deep perception, bittul mekere, of the fact that its own source is totally godly, right? Harehu nechlash, it becomes weakened, right? It loses all its independent strength, its wildness, right? That the horse is bucking and wants to throw the rider off. It loses all of that strength. The yetze mima'amadai u'matzav harishan, and it departs from its initial state. It's transported to a whole new way of being. The naser muchshar la'seisei lekli, and it becomes ready to be made into a vessel. Right? A vessel for godliness. It's ready to become that transportation for godliness. And now, finally, you can understand why Psukei de Zimra and Birchas Kriya Shema, the part of davening from Baruch She'amar until, but not including the Shema, is called table. Right? The bed was called the bed because it's what we do on our bed every evening before we go to sleep. Right? The simplest explanation. Right, which was saying the Shema at night. Then you have to put in this room for the spirit of godliness, in this process of transforming the animal soul, you have to put a table. The table is from Baruch She'amar until, but not including, the Shema. Why is it called the table? The intention behind calling it a table is because the entire act of worship of the verses of praise and the blessings before the Shema, where the main part of the worship is carving out the animal soul, with the two carvings previously described, the external carving which separates it from evil, and then the inner carving to make it a vessel for the godly light, Shehu al yedei bittul hatzir shel nefesh habahamis, which is by totally negating, totally transforming the very form of the animal soul. Dehine hanefesh. Okay. So why is it called a table? Because you are totally transforming the animal. And you don't see the connection immediately, but it's a long sentence, so we'll get there. But that's the first step. Why is it called a table? Because the entire purpose of this part of davening is to transform the animal. There's two steps. You carve it from the outside, and then you carve it from the inside. In other words, you separate it from evil by showing it how all of the evil things are really sourced in godliness, all of the selfish things that it loves are really godly, and then you carve it from the inside by saying, in fact, your very selfishness itself can be godly. Your very selfishness itself has a godly source, right? You carve it from the outside and the inside. And then you totally transform its shape, its form. Transform its form. You transform its shape, right? What do we mean transform its shape? He's going to say something very important now. This next line is very important. Because what is the animal soul? And this is what I said, we're going to get to why is it the faster horse, right? This is the explanation. Why is the animal soul the faster horse? What is the animal soul? Because the animal soul is a keach hamisaveh. which means it is an illogical desire. That's essentially what it is. The animal soul is an illogical desire, or in Yiddish, a koyach was will. It is a want. It is a will. That's what the animal soul is. The animal soul is a being of will. Right? What does it mean to want or to will, by the way? There's really two different types. There's one that God and holy things do, and there's one that unholy things, like the animal soul, do. Right? And ungodly things, like the animal that the animal soul does. So we're not going to talk about the holy one, because I don't want to confuse things even more. What we mean a will in regular terms, non-godly terms, we mean there's a lack. Right? A very profound insight. The animal soul, all things that are not really real, all things that are not really based in godliness, right? It's a klippa. A klippa is a shell, right? Why is a klippa a shell? Why do we call negative things in Chassidus a shell or a peel, or a husk? The husk of the fruit, right? The banana peel, right? Why is a banana peel the perfect metaphor for all non-godly things in Chassidus, right?
It hides the fruit.
What?
It hides the fruit.
It hides the fruit, but what does that mean? It means that all the definition is external, right? What is the animal soul? It's a want. What does it mean, a want? It means, what's a want? Why do you want? You want because you don't have, right? Which is why in Old English, want is the same as lack, right? To be found wanting means you're found to not have, to not possess, right? I want because I don't have. Right? So in other words, what is the fundamental nature of something that is inherently selfish and finite and denies God? Its essential nature is non-being, emptiness, right? It's empty. Not a good non-being. There's two different types of that too. It's an emptiness. It's empty. All it is it wants. It wants and it wants and it wants and it wants and it wants. Where does it end? When is it ever filled up? You tell me. Never, right? The more it gets, nothing can fill that hole. It has all it is an empty hole that's open to more and more things. That's all it is, right? And there's very deep, I want to point out, this is not a class about therapy. This is not a psychological concept. It is a psychological concept, but it's based on a very profound existential concept. In other words, this doesn't have to do just how the animal soul feels or thinks. It has to do with how it is in the way God made it, in a very, very profound way. Right? Which unfortunately, at this juncture, I don't have time to explain the whole thing to you. Maybe we'll talk more about it next week. But it's a very, very profound metaphysical truth of the animal soul. The way God creates things that appear to be self-contained entities. Things that are like God, except they're finite. What's God like? God has no cause. God is an independent being. The difference by God is that that's true. It's not empty, it's full. There's actually something there that is real, that does exist independently. All finite things which appear to exist independently, which includes the animals, everything from the animal soul to a frog to this table, right? By what means do they exist? God. They exist, well, obviously from God, but what's their nature? Their nature is an inner emptiness. They're empty. They're being, or a different way of saying they're empty, a slightly more philosophical, but I think illuminating way of saying it is, they exist only in relation to other things. God exists inherently. If everything else ceases to exist, God continues to exist. How does everything else exist? Only in relation. I only exist in relation to other things, which is a different way of saying, what is the animal soul? It's a will, it's a want. It's an emptiness that is trying to fill itself, right? Like you imagine a vacuum that pulls all this stuff close. It can't ever be filled, right? So the inside is always empty, but it pulls all this stuff around it. So it appears from the outside like it's solid, like there's a solid ball, there's a solid clump of stuff. Even though what is it really? It's a vacuum on the inside that's holding all of this stuff together. But if you open it and you open it and you open it all the way inside, what will you find? Nothing. There's nothing inside, right? It's empty. That's what the animal soul is. The animal soul is defined by its desire, by its want, by its lack of other things, right? Something else is not here. In fact, even down to the very physical time and space that we occupy, right? Why does something exist? Because nothing else is in that space, right? Fundamental law of physics. No two things can occupy the same place, right? At the same time. Why? Because that's why our world is a world of lies, as we learned in Tanya. I don't know if anyone remembers that class. It was a long time ago. But that's why our world is called a world of lies, because how does everything exist in our world? Everything exists only in terms of the time and space it takes up. In other words, nothing is self-defined. Nothing is defined by its inherent quality. Everything is defined by its relationship to other things. But hang on, if everything is defined by its relationship to other things, right, that means that none of them actually really exist. The only thing that's really here is a relation, right? It's only the relationships that are really here, because inside each thing is nothing. It only exists by dint of relation, right? I know this is a lot to squeeze into the last 3 minutes. We'll have to discuss this a lot more next week, God willing. But the point, I just want to finish the point here. The animal soul is a will, right? It's a will. It's an empty thing that wills. That's what makes it, ironically, the fast horse, right? Godly soul, godly, full, doesn't need, doesn't want, doesn't pursue, right? Slow horse, what's the rush? Ma boyev, right? Why do I need to go anywhere, the godly soul, right? Why does a self-sufficient being, where are they in a rush to go? Nowhere, right? But if you can take the animal soul, that fact that it is empty, that it's a vacuum and it constantly wants more, right? That itself is not a bad thing. In fact, that itself is an incredibly good thing. It's an incredibly good thing that it's empty and wants more. Because if you can direct it towards godliness, it has an unbelievable power that is unmatched. That's the answer to the question. That's why you need the animal soul. That's why the animal soul is the fast horse. Because it's empty and it wants to be full, right? And if you can direct that will, if you can direct that desire towards holiness, like a rocket, like the fast horse, right? You'll go further than you would ever expect to go. Otherwise, we will have to explain more about this, I think, God willing, next week.